Welcome back, fellow dissidents. Been a while, but what can I say? The state of censorship is rather appalling, and as I try to engage as much as is possible, sometimes it's just discouraging. It's not a lack of effort or a lack of desire, but just the overall climate can be rather intimidating. But I figured I'd hop on and discuss some of the things that are being said, whether it be economic or cultural or whatever have you. First of all, you got uh, the situation with the recession, and it's I had a I had a Lyft driver a month ago ask me if I have a recurring fare, and I've had this same driver a few times, and we had discussed a little bit of politics and by implication economics as well. And I had him ask me one time if if I thought we were going into a recession, and I told him by colloquial definition, we were technically inside of one, though the data hasn't come out yet, of two consecutive quarters, uh, resulting in negative GDP growth. But nevertheless, that was the case. This was about maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago. 5 or 6 weeks ago. So at that time, we would have been in a recession, but the data hadn't come out yet, and the data is manipulated anyway. GDP, GNP, CPI, all of these numbers are drastically conformed to the establishment, their narrative. These basically GDP in the colloquial term is domestic product, product and the economy, and its supposedly immediate effects and statistics as it pertains to inside the borders, and then GNP would be just the entire thing, theoretically, internationally as well. But it's all the if you're at all in tune with fundamental economics, economics 101, and if you go down the trail of the Austrians, there's while they hold colloquial definitions, they elaborate much clearer, more concise, and much more nuance is given to the position. But I mean, you gotta like colloquial language will say that inflation, rather than talking about consumer price value inflation, which is rising prices, that's what is colloquially known as inflation. When in an Austrian perspective, inflation is, and this is I accept it as a priori. It is a fact that inflation, the definition is increasing the monetary supply. Now, you know, they're trying. You see all of this propaganda and the rhetoric coming out of the establishment in the White House, and them. There's this fussing. There's this narrative around whether or not we are in a recession, and not only has the technical definition been accepted for a very long time, but it also just further distracts, and now we're talking about semantics rather than the actual economic thing, the economic ramifications that we're actually dealing with. I mean, most folks don't need to be told when they're at the gas pump or the grocery store whether or not consumer price values have risen, without an equal or relatively comparable rise in wage rates. So, it's they have this very effective strategy of changing the nomenclature or the colloquial definitions or at least sparking some amount of conversation surrounding it, to where you're let off the beaten path. But let it not be mistaken that what we are feeling right now is an effect of not only just 100 years of monetary policy and central banking that is beyond deplorable and fraudulent. That's a whole nother conversation. But specifically, the last 2+ years, you had an entire tyrannical global movement to stop the economy in its tracks, and then multiple, particularly Western governments, via the central banking system and the cartel, they inflated the monetary supply rapidly, and this has so many drastic and logical implications that we are dealing with as of now. And I hate this the partisan hackery of more right-leaning individuals pay their lip service to free markets, so therefore they're automatically more valid in economic discussion, whether they're conservative or they're monetarists or they're Austrians or Keynesians. Like, none of that is taken into account on a more nuanced basis. When you're talking amongst just regular folks who aren't down the rabbit hole of Austrian economics, the right-leaning people tend to get a better shake, just for the simple fact that they pay lip service to free markets. And this is in fact the case with Trump as well, when underneath his leadership, supposedly democratically elected and all this good stuff, right? This is what lends to the moral legitimacy of the president of the United States, right? And then supposedly his more free market outlook is why the economy was doing so well. Well, the unprecedented amount of inflation was done under his watch. And people want to, blame it all on the Fed. And yes, it is the Fed, but the Fed is just another wing of the establishment. Sure, it's a private entity. It's not actually a wing of the government, but it's a cartel, a global cartel that is linked inherently to Western governments. So, and the money that they pass through has to come through in the form of lending to the federal government. So it is in fact due directly to whoever the establishment leader is, and that includes Trump and his nearly $4 trillion in 2020 alone, with the economy shut and locked down. And then it is further exacerbated by the change in regime, and then you got Biden who comes in, and not to mention the speculative market and whatever's happening globally. To say that Putin and his war of aggression, or that's what they say it is, it seems rather it's reprehensible. We'll leave it at that. This is a discussion about economics, but nevertheless, to say that is having no effect would in fact be incomplete at best, because it does have an effect. But nevertheless, we've got rapid inflation of the monetary supply again under Biden. Plus, it took all this time to even come back to some semblance of normalcy. There's many places in the Western world still to this day that are under emergency orders, and they're still undergoing some form of medical tyranny still. So, but I say all that just to say that there is no partisan, you have to excuse me, there's a thunderstorm at the moment, but there is no partisan answer when we're looking at the uniparty. They all inflate the monetary supply for their own gain. Now given Trump was not aligned with your typical establishment figures, so he wasn't, the money wasn't being redistributed in a normal fashion, as we would say, for the establishment regime. But nevertheless, this is an inherent tax on the lower class and the middle class. It is exacerbating the difference in class mobility. It's simple supply and demand. If you have more of any type of commodity or service, that drives the price, the value, down. This is, some monetarists don't agree with it, but there's Keynesians don't agree with it, but the Austrians have it absolutely correct. This is also in the case of the medium of exchange, your money. So if you have more dollars chasing the same amount of diminishing product, therefore you have less buying power. There is less value to the dollar. So, and this manifests in a lot of different ways. It's a very complex set of mechanics when you're talking about money. It's not as simple as folks actually think. Now, it can be if you do your research. You can start with something like basic economics with Henry Hazlitt and go down the Austrian rabbit hole. I typically tell people to go straight for Mises, Ludwig von Mises. He's a prominent, the most prominent Austrian for sure, and he was the most influential economist in terms of free markets in the early 20th century. And if it's hard to digest. It's a lot of complex ideas. It's you have to have at least a fundamental grasp of basic economics to be able to hold your salt when you're dealing with real Austrian theory and the business cycles and the theory of money and credit and all this. But Ludwig von Mises is great, and Robert Murphy has a book called Choice, and it's essentially a distilled version of Ludwig von Mises's Human Action. And Human Action is something like 900 pages, so it's very intimidating. A lot of jargon in there that you have to get very familiar with before you can even digest the full nuance of the. I've read it probably 5 or 6 times, and I'm still not like and I'm nowhere near a PhD level economist. I just understand the ideas fairly well. You can take it even farther, and that's what led me down the hole of libertarianism and economics and that's how I ended up at Rothbard, because Rothbard, was he was a student of Mises. He just took it farther and said that it applies to government as well. Whereas Mises was more in a traditional liberal state, as he just thought that government was there to protect the rights and sovereignty of the people and supply defense and courts and such, but as minimal as possible, right? A minarchist. But all of this nuance gets lost in semantic juggling and just to talk about irrelevant parts of it. Well, what really needs to be justified is how, even after all this time, we're talking about semantics and political theater rather than the fact that the establishment decided to lock down the entire economy, all right, and then decide arbitrarily who is essential and who is not. Now, this is the great thesis and production that was given by Mises in the early 1900s. He definitively showed why socialism and central planning, whatever flavor your socialism is, whether it's right wing or left wing or it's full communism, whatever, he definitively refuted socialism, that it can't work, central planning can't work, and it was just further taken by libertarians to its final conclusion. But you cannot, without market prices and structures and the incentive of competition and innovation, you absolutely cannot calculate prices. So there's a misallocation of resources. So there's no way that any one group of bureaucrats or one human being could ever do what the production of the market can. And the fact that the government not only took on this role, but most people willingly handed it over, that leads me into what else I wanted to talk about. Is it's not just the economics. I think the culture is inherently tied to it, because there's this idea that because libertarians and anarchists, we defend um, anything that fits inside the non-aggression axiom, that it's libertinism. Libertinism is basically a revolt against authority, and there's no personal accountability, and that's not at all what an Austrian or a Rothbardian or a Hoppian anarchist or private property anarchist or market anarchist, whatever you want to call them, anarcho-capitalist, radical libertarians. There's many different labels for what this is, but inherently tied to the non-aggression principle is morals, individual responsibility, culture, the right of inclusion of your property, what you choose to do with your property, which is your person and your naturally appropriated or voluntarily traded property, and your rights therein. Also, by very definition of being able to include people or other contractual obligations, also gives you the right of exclusion, right? But this veers radically into an area where most people aren't comfortable, because we come up in a culture of multiculturalism, egalitarianism, default liberalism in today's colloquial sense of liberalism. You come out of public schools indoctrinated just as a automatically left leaning of some sort. So your natural inclination is to say, whoa, 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 we need to be inclusive, right? Not exclusive. But if Hans Hermann Hoppe, he took this much farther than most libertarians typically take it. But essentially, what he's saying is that you have to have culture tied to it. Fundamental morals and responsibilities and principles have to be inherently tied with the culture. Now, as long as you're not like, say in the case of like heroin use, we often get flack because we want to decriminalize at a minimum, and and stop, take away the violations of people's personal rights for putting a substance in their body. Now, I'm a recovering drug user, so morally and principally, I would never advocate for somebody to actually use heroin. But I also don't think that if they do so, they deserve to be locked in a cage for years on end and accosted by the government. As long as you're not violating somebody's personal property in their person or their things, then it's a different thing, right? But that's the difference. Is there's economic reasons and moral reasons for accepting this doctrine. But then there's also the case that has to be made that the culture, say everything was as an anarchist, market anarchist would like it to be, right? Ideally, there would be no states, right? Or if there was states, there would be some amount of geographical location where there is no state, and everything is privately owned, and it would be up to the private property owners to decide what they're doing. Now, you can voluntarily contract, and you can choose whether or not people are allowed to smoke, or they're allowed to use drugs, or whatever the case, what the speed limits are, things of this nature. All of that would be, you'd be able to cede some here and agree to that there, just so long as it was voluntary and you could opt out, given the contract terms. Okay, but that also means that you're going to have people that are culturally similar, whether it be in a right wing or ethnicity, even. It could even be religious values. People will automatically build hierarchical cultures around what they assimilate to, right? So you're gonna have these areas where you want certain people around and certain people not, and this is where Hoppe was absolutely foundational in the liberty movement, because not only is it tied inherently to the white hot culture war, but it's libertarianism taken to its logical conclusion. And some libertarians I've argued with folks on social media on whether or not there even is a left wing libertarianism, and I guess in colloquial terms, yes, you can have an egalitarian outlook so long as you abide the non-aggression principle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those cultures, people who are inherently tied to hierarchical structures rather than egalitarian would mesh well if they were, forced to integrate. That's why you're allowed to exclude folks. You would be allowed to be around people that you choose to be. Now, if it was somebody like Tim Pool, he claims he's a left libertarian. He's basically just a liberal, but you know, someone like that I could be around because it's not that they wouldn't force their views. They have their own morals, they have their own scruples. Those kinds of people would be able to be integrated. But there's some folks that just wouldn't be, like people who are statists, for example, people who would like a government, and not only are they happy with their own government, but they want you to be forced to be under the geographical or jurisdictional authority of their government as well. And these ideas just do not bode well. So, there's an inherent link between the economic ideas and the fallacies that are espoused, whether right or left, in this country, other than the Austrians, but tied into that is this caricature of what libertarianism is. You know, I even myself sometimes distance myself from the name of libertarian because I am a libertarian. I'm a pure libertarian, is what I believe. Austrian and Rothbardian, Hoppian idea of private property rights, private property anarchy, or market anarchy. Like, this is the logical conclusion of libertarianism. But there's this caricature in the culture war. Like when Jo Jorgensen was running for the 2020 nomination, and she outright came out with, it's not enough. This was a social media tweet. She said, it's not enough to be passively not racist. You have to be actively anti-racist. Now, not only is this a propaganda of a neo-Marxist nomenclature, but it's also the paradox of a libertarian telling you what you have to do, right? There's this inherent or maybe even just implicit exception of libertarianism being left-leaning because that's what the party, the National Party, was tied to. They tried to play this moderate role where we'll play the egalitarianism game when in all reality, this is why I argue that libertarianism is in fact right-wing. It has been right-wing, and it has to remain right-wing, because you cannot have an egalitarian structure where you are forced to integrate with folks if, it has to be a hierarchical, voluntary society. This is why I argue that has to be right-wing. I used to look at myself, I believe it even a couple of years ago, maybe even when I first started this, I was still claiming that I was a left-leaning libertarian because I was scared. I was scared to take libertarianism to its full conclusion. And it wasn't until I dug deep into the recesses of the Austrians and just all around the Mises Institute and the Libertarian Institute, Ron Paul Institute, and all of these anarchist ideas, looking for the whole. Where is the fallacy? Where is the problem in this theory? And I don't claim to be an academic. I don't claim to be the smartest man in the world, but I'll tell you what, I haven't found a logical inconsistency in the theory. It is the most consistent theory. And this is why Dave Smith he's so foundational in the liberty movement, because he so readily and easily understands these ideas and is able to portray them to regular people. And this is what I aspire to do. It's like, but it has to be understood that while we will defend the implicit axioms, the a priorisms of libertarianism, we also recognize at the same time that there is a white hot culture war, and this leftist collectivist pathogen has attached to people's brains. Right now, as long as you adhere to the non-aggression principle, we can form coalitions. Same thing like with Tim Pool. He's fantastic at aggregating news And I even subscribe to his channel and the timcast.com. I salute free props for my channel right now. But it also has to be understood that there is implicit culture and responsibility and moral normities that have to be followed because of we see the cultural decay. Now, that's not to say that you have to be anything. You can be whatever you want. You can, uh, you know, so long as you are abiding the principles, there, there is a coalition to be had. But I think if we actually want to make any type of strategic dent, it has to be done culturally. People have to accept the logical conclusions, that are tied to libertarianism and anarchism. Uh, Specifically, the fact that um, you cannot have a libertarian order without moral and cultural norms. This culture war and this idea that egalitarianism or equity or whatever the buzzword is, that's what the cultural and moral norms should be. That has to be discarded. Has to be discarded. We have to have cultural and moral norms that everybody in the society agrees with, or else we can deal with each other from a distance. That's the beauty of the division of labor, specialization, and free markets, is that we can choose to do with our property as we choose, and folks won't even know each other, but in some form of the division of labor, they are interacting with each other because it's of their own self-interest, right? So as long as folks uphold their own their own moral norms and they abide by the non-aggression axiom, then we can at least spatially be involved in the same geographical location, right? But it doesn't have to be tied to a geographical location. And if it is, it needs to be of a certain cultural or moral norms, personal responsibility, and things of this nature. Because you absolutely cannot have a free society that is not orderly. This is another caricature in the fallacy of what they portray libertarianism to be. You would have order. Anarchy is the mother of order, per Michael Malice. It's you would have all of these institutions. It would just be much more efficient, and there would be a lot more accountability in our security and our judicial systems, and you wouldn't pay a debt to society. If there was a victim, you would recompense the victim, and there would be a market service for this. It's this idea that all cultural norms in America come from the left, so you have to adhere to the left or in some way placate the left is absurd, in my opinion. So I hope this was informative. I really am trying to figure out what I can do to be more persistent in my content creation, because it's difficult, man. It's difficult when there's just so much stuff. I got a full-time job, and I don't even need to give you the spiel for real, but it's not as simple as it looks. But I am in the liberty movement, and I hope to progress through the liberty movement, and I hope that even just a random conversation of economics and culture could be of use to somebody. So by all means, if you enjoy the content, please like, share, subscribe. I'll catch you on the next one.